And now it is my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Sarah Avtzon. Sarah is an assistant professor at New York City's Daemen College, where she works in the master's program in early childhood special education and does a number of things there. She has master's degrees from Teachers College of Columbia University, and she is a Ph.D. candidate at Walden University. And in fact, the information that she's sharing with us today is part of her dissertation work, so we're really excited to be able to share this with you today. She speaks all over New York City and reviews manuscripts and does all kinds of professional educational activities. So I think that pretty much covers Sarah's background. And Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Betsy. Thank you for this wonderful introduction. And thank you all for joining us in today's presentation. I guess I'm going to add just one little thing. I do have a French accent, and I just hope that no one is going to need a translation. But if anyone does, Betsy, you pick up.
Will do.
So I'm really pleased to share with you today some understanding about children with specific learning disability and some of the findings from the study that I conducted about the intervention and this intervention that might aid students and children or learners in your care who are having learning difficulty.
Sarah, Sarah, you're going to want to share your screen.
Oh, okay. I didn't do that?
I'm sure you remember.
Let's see. I thought I did.
I'm not seeing the presentation yet, so I want to make sure everybody can see what we want them to see.
Sure, absolutely. I apologize for that. Let's do that quite quickly. Share. Is it coming up?
I don't see it yet.
Okay. All right, I shared the top here. Oh, I apologize for this. Let's just see. Manage the panels.
If you go to the Quick Start tab at the top of your screen.
Right. That's what I did. Share my desktop. But
okay, now we're getting something.
Is it? Okay. Well, let's hope it's doing it now. It's doing it on my screen. Okay, error message.
We don't so far don't see the, well, I think we're getting close. Okay, so if you pull your PowerPoint presentation.
Oh, there it is. Okay, great. All right. Now let's see. I wanted it in big view this way. All right. I'm hoping everybody can see it, but do you do?
Turn it into slideshow. If you start the slideshow, there you go. Perfect.
Okay. Done it. Okay. Great. So I was just introducing the entire slideshow, and I apologize for you, not being able to see it at first. So I'll be glad, as Betsy said, to entertain any questions you may have, so please don't hesitate to write them on the chat box, and I'll try to answer as many of them as possible. And I hope to accomplish some of the goals that we have for today. So if you're anything like me, you may be wondering what in the world would video games do for children's instruction. My training says destruction is more like it. Of course, I knew this was not just a video game. I knew it was designed with input from various disciplinarians and that it was based on neuroscience principles for the purpose of cognitive skill training. So to rephrase, I'll be sharing with you today the findings of this quantitative study that I pursued on the effect of neuroscience-based cognitive training in the form of video games, and seeing that effect on cognitive and academic performance of children with SLD in grades 2 to 4. And as Betsy said before, it is a mouthful, but basically the question is, would neuroscience training, which in this case came in the form of video games, help children with SLD think and learn better? Well, let's provide some contextual background to the study, and for that, I'd like to briefly answer 4 questions. First, what does SLD mean? What does specific learning disability mean? And historically, there's been a lot of confusion on that. And 2, what are some of those cognitive deficits or weak learning tools that are associated with SLD? Which are they? And thirdly, once we know those cognitive deficits that are presumed to be associated with SLD, what is the relationship between them and the specific academic skills that are required in school, such as reading and math? And lastly, for at least the first part of the presentation, we'll try to see what are the gaps in the current intervention approaches of SLD. And coming from my background in special education, we've got a whole slew. So what's not working, and why is it that we're looking elsewhere? And I'll just say a brief little thing here, that my home approach in special education is usually that of a transdisciplinarian, one that seeks answers from my field, special education, but also that of the field of other disciplinarian. So when looking at treating a special needs child, I'm looking more at a holistic approach and looking at the child's current needs and the strategies I can use from what I know from my field, but more importantly also from other disciplines that could inform me, such as an SLP, a speech and language pathologist, an occupational pathologist, an occupational therapist, a psychologist, etc. So we'll be looking at what gaps prompted me to look into neuroscience, and in the second part of the presentation, we'll try to decipher some of the findings of the study. So for those who have been wondering why I focused on SLD, firstly, I'd like to say that it's my personal motivation and my passion to work with children with SLD, and anyone who knows me can attest to that. And perhaps I'll explain a little bit why, most of you probably listening in could identify with the feeling of seeing children who are generally competent, but then unexpectedly we see something that's puzzling or hard for them. And that takes a toll on all of us teachers and parents, and looking at the frustration associated with that. So that's my number one, motivation. I guess my number 2 is the statistics that you see in front of you. Unfortunately, as you can see, it is the condition served with the highest percentage, according to the U.S. Department of Education, and close to 40% of children served in special education are children with SLD. Even according to the statistics for the 2009 and 10 school year for the 50 states, only 10% transferred to regular education. Thankfully, we do see a decline from 1990 to 2008, and perhaps that decline is more due to better classifications. Who knows? But it is quite, a good feeling. Yet the number of 40% is quite alarming. So let's briefly define this very long definition is right here on the screen for us to help us kind of understand what is SLD. And the way IDEA, the Individuals with a Disability Education Act, defines it, the operational definition is it's a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or in using language, spoken or written, which disorder may manifest itself in imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, write, spell, and do mathematical calculations. And if you see, I highlighted those words, basic psychological processes. When we look at this construct of SLD, we recognize how a disorder in the basic psychological processes is really the basis of our understanding of what SLD is. And as I said before, there seems to be 2 key characteristics of SLD, one of which I briefly described. When we look at the hallmark characteristics that differentiate a student with LD from the one who doesn't, the unexpectedness is key. The child is usually perceived as competent, but the learning difficulty is puzzling or surprising even. Why is it that this child, who's generally competent, having difficulty? We see also children who are achieving fairly well in areas of daily academics, but yet we see this drop, this deficit. And they are pretty specific in reading, writing, or math, and presumably due to these underlying neurological deficits that are causing severe problems in reading, writing, or math. historically, there has been much transition in how we determine SLD, and I can't get into it in this session. But I'd like to highlight the current regulations and make the connection to our understanding of SLD based on the framework of the study. So we no longer use the discrepancy criteria between IQ and achievement to determine SLD, as you see in number 1, but we use number 2 and number 3 approaches. Number 2 state basically that to determine a child with SLD, one can use an assessment that's based on a child's response to scientific research-based intervention, like the RTI model, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. When the child does not achieve adequately for his age or meet the state-approved grade level standards when provided with learning experiences or instruction that's appropriate to his age, one looks at which areas are affected and then determines the SLD classification. And generally, we look at oral expression, listening comprehension, written expression, basic reading skills, fluency skills in reading, reading comprehension, math calculation, and math problem solving. Those seem to be the areas that are generally affected by the diagnosis of specific learning disability. So that's one approach, is to see the response of the child to RTI models or any other research-based intervention. Number 3, the other type of evaluation or determination that's used is a comprehensive evaluation that determines the pattern of strengths and weaknesses in the child's performance, achievement, and cognition, both relative to age, grade level, and or intellectual development. So what you would see, though, in that kind of an evaluation is a determination of the pattern of the strengths and weaknesses that interfere with the child's ability to learn. This kind of an assessment seems to take that much more meaning, especially for children with SLD, just because we're able to make a connection between those psychological processes that interfere with the child's ability to learn, and as we know now, are the underlying reasons for the child's difficulty. And by the way, this third approach to SLD determination is used now in about 21 states in the United States. So that's pretty good news, and to keep that understanding in our mind really gets us to focus on what's the importance of assessing a child and coming up with a diagnosis or a classification. Truly, as all of us here in this presentation could attest, that the primary focus of assessment is really intervention. Figuring out why the child is having difficulty is going to help us shape how we intervene. It's not enough to describe the behaviors of concern in order to design an effective intervention approach. And in our case, working with children with SLD, understanding those cognitive correlates to academic achievement could really inform the intervention plan. In other words, I have a little equation there for those mathematical learners, figuring out the child's unique patterns of strengths and weaknesses in the way they think and the way they achieve is going to help the therapist plan an intervention that's more aligned with their cognitive processes. Just like a child who's blind or deaf, or a child with autism needs specific instructional models, so too the students with learning disability need specific instructional models based on his or her specific neurologically based disabilities. We are in a trend in our field of special education to kind of look for generic answers and generic strategies, still very helpful to children with SLD. And they might look like the ones like what you see right now on the screen. Currently in special education, with interventionists who make a serious effort to link assessment of underlying cognitive skills and intervention, the treatment plan looks like what you see here. And if you just peruse it or gaze at it, it looks like it embeds necessary accommodations and adaptations to the curriculum and the environment that need to be made to help the child use his or her strengths and compensate for his or her weakness. So if you look, let's say, at short-term memory, if a child is deficient or has weak short-term memory, we're going to be using short instructions, simple instructions, lots of repetition, some memory strategies. Students who have problems holding words or sounds in working memory simply can't benefit from a lecture that's just not supported by visual cues. This one is, but remember what it's like to know just a little French when you try to understand those rapidly delivered directions to the airport in Paris. Excuse me. So if a child, actually like the one I encountered in my study, said, I remember everything I see, Miss Sarah, the teacher intelligently capitalizes on that strength by developing a sight word vocabulary or a coding system that accommodates or supplements those weak language processing of this little child. So in special education, actually, what we do, and I'm going to quote Dr. Schultz from Harvard University, we mine for assets. We look for those strengths of the students, and we develop accommodations to increase the success and the confidence that comes from it. And that's wonderful, considering that there is enough documented research that shows that this approach does yield certain results. Where's my problem then? Here's the current gap. The gap is the way I phrase it is really stated in this chart, and I'm going to just go through it by reading it at this time, just so that we can get a synopsis of what I'm trying to state in terms of the gap. That although there is evidence that children with learning disabilities have weak neurological processes and that they have some specific information processing deficits, the current practices in special education, as I explained before, focus primarily on interventions targeting the deficit academic area, as opposed to intervention targeting the weak underlying neurological processes. And so as a result, many children who are diagnosed with SLD don't necessarily improve their cognitive abilities and don't necessarily respond well to special education or RTI. Perhaps those are the ones that concern us more. The ones who respond to RTI, we're okay, and we're saying something is working and it's helping them. And I guess, if I were to see your faces, I guess I can probably see lots of eyes and heads nodding to the fact that we do have so many who do not respond well to special education or to RTI, and we are trying to look for answers. And I don't know that we have them all, but certainly I'd like to share what I've found. So if I have to restate the problem, is the approach to bypass and minimize the processing deficits of the children with SLD through accommodations and adaptations and compensatory strategies? Or is it that we could remediate the cognitive deficits that are correlated with the academic failure? Can we remediate those learning tools that are linked with reading and math? And it may be a question not of either or. It might be that we need to blend approaches. Are there any other approaches than this one that can be included in the treatment plan so that we can target those weak underlying processes and help the child use them as opposed to compensate for them? And that's what led me to the study. So to frame it and to give some background about the main cognitive deficits you would ask that are associated with SLD, which are they? And you see executive function is one, and the other is working memory. These two cognitive processes have been highly documented in the research as the two that are seen both with children who have disabilities in reading and in math or writing. And because they are common to all, I'm starting with these two, and they also seem to be the key. Excuse me for a second, I'm sorry. Great. In defining what is working memory, which again is a new term that is adopted by psychologists and educators in the field, especially people working with children with SLD, recent research in cognitive neuroscience has indicated that SLD and executive functions are the two main, although there are other ones connected, which I'll explain in a moment. I want to look at the definition of what is working memory so we can get a grasp of how it affects children in learning experiences before we try to understand the importance of finding a solution or finding some techniques and strategies. So Baddeley in 1990 described working memory as a system for temporarily storing and manipulating information while executing complex cognitive tasks that involve learning, reasoning, and comprehension. In simpler terms, working memory seems to refer to our ability to hold and manipulate information in the mind over a short period of time while we do something effortful with it. Jensen calls it the mind scratch pad, and I love that. It's very connected to what I'll say next in terms of why is working memory important. Working memory is important because it provides that mental workspace, that mind scratch pad in which we can hold information while mentally engage in other relevant activities. And the capacity to do so is crucial to many learning activities in the classroom. Children often have to hold information in mind while engaged in certain hard or difficult or thoughtful activities. The information to be remembered may, for example, be the sentence that they intend to write while they're trying to spell out the individual words, or it could also be a list of instruction given by the teacher while carrying out individual steps in the task. Well, children with small working memory capacities seem to struggle with these activities simply because they're unable to hold in mind that sufficient information to allow them to complete the task. And losing crucial information from working memory is going to cause them to forget many things, such as, instruction they're attempting to follow, details that they're, of what they're to do, where they have got to in that complicated task, or any other multi-step instruction that they have to follow. So children with low working memory fail to meet those demands in the classroom, and sometimes acquiring that incremental knowledge over the school years is somewhat disrupted. So that explains a little bit, working memory and how crucial it is in the classroom and why children with SLD may have difficulties learning. Let's look now at the other main characteristic or cognitive process, and that is executive function. It is defined as the cognitive process that regulates an individual's ability to organize thoughts and activities, prioritize tasks, manage time efficiently, and make decisions. In other words, these kind of skills help us create everything that we do in everyday life. Can create a picture of a goal, a path to that goal, and the resources we will need along the way. So, for example, a child getting ready for basketball league and gathering his gear from all over the house, but on his way he sees his ED.S, so he decides to sit and play and forgets that he has a goal to attain. These functions help us remember the picture even though the goal may be far away or other events come along the way to occupy our attention and take up our space in our memory. I love Lynn Meltzer's description. And so I'm going to share it with you, and that's why I have that little graph. These students have information coming into a funnel that needs to be processed and prioritized. Lynn Meltzer is the co-founder and the co-director of the Institute of Learning and Development and professor at Tufts University. And she says that students with learning disabilities and ADHD share a similar executive function problem, an information overload, basically. So as you see on the top of the funnel, they have information coming in that needs to be processed and prioritized. They also have to figure out what is most important, ignore the irrelevant information that came in, and shift from the main ideas to the detail. But they can't. The funnel is clogged. And as a result, these students can't produce the kind of projects and essays required. And it's like they're carrying all that information that came at the top of the funnel the whole time. And that's difficult because I don't have room to add any more information and do the rest of the tasks that are required. So executive functions or skills seem to be like an umbrella term, therefore, for all those things that we do for planning, organization, inhibition. it helps the child with self-regulatory activities such as, checking after one's work, monitoring one's work, revising when learning. And it also includes that cognitive flexibility, such as sorting, organizing, and prioritizing information. So, if you have questions about your kindergartner, how does that look like? Well, your kindergartner running errands and doing a 2 or 3 step direction to do so, performing their self-help tasks like zippering their coat, following safety rules, or your 3rd or 5th grader bringing books and papers and assignment to and from school, planning simple projects such as a book report, which might include selecting a book, reading the book, writing the report, keeping track of daily schedules. And we could all relate to some of these things, being faced with children who have SLD. Children with SLD then have difficulty with numerous facets of executive function. According to Meltzer and Christian, another big name in executive function, their reasoning ability of children may not match their output and productivity. It's just that they may have a higher level of conceptual reasoning ability, but it doesn't, come out or project itself in that way. So, for example, to make the link with academics, executive skills involved in reading would include things like drawing on prior knowledge, as students shift from retrieving and interpreting the background information and attending to the print or the new content at hand. It might include mental flexibility that would help the students interpret the words that they're reading, draw inferences, and perhaps even process some of that redundant information in the text. And one more part of executive function skills that would be involved in reading would be prioritizing as students decide which parts of the text is useful for their purpose. And in writing, it would require students to plan, engage in that flexible thinking of paraphrasing the topic, organizing it, and prioritizing it. Students with executive function problems may also be poor test takers. They're unable to prioritize which information to study when preparing for the test. That's probably the first issue. And next, as they take the test, they're unable to prioritize the tasks and plan for the responses or monitor their time. Again, a mismatch between conceptual reasoning and output. So for parents and teachers, EF problems also manifest themselves through behavioral problems, and I'm sure that's where we encounter more of the difficulty in terms of strategy. So, for example, some children may act inappropriately because they do not plan or anticipate the consequences of their behavior. In other words, children who cannot inhibit their actions, they may continue to behave inappropriately even when they understand the consequences of those actions. And we know so well how they understand the consequences of their actions, but they just can't inhibit their actions on site when in the moment. Children who have difficulty evaluating also may not be able to learn from consequences and will therefore repeat inappropriate behavior. So failure to plan, to inhibit behavior despite good intentions, and failure to evaluate can together lead students to act inappropriately. And so special educators may use many strategies to help students improve executive functions, such as checklist, how-to-do list, I should say how-to list because it's very wide, breaking long assignments into chunks and using visual calendars, time organizer, and mnemonics. Meltzer, as in his book Executive Functions in Education, strategies for memorization, such as, use the crazier the phrase, the better in acronyms, and that would help. To increase mental flexibility, use riddles and jokes, and help the students shift between word meanings. And in math, you can even have students ask themselves, do I know another way to solve this problem? Does this look similar to other problems I've seen? To help with prioritization, help the child listen to change in the tone of the teacher so they can recognize what's important and what's not. And in that way, they can highlight most important ideas in one color and details in another color. For note-taking, you can help students by helping them prioritize and remember the information through a 3-column chart. I love that one. On the first column, core concept. The second column is, details supporting the concept. And the third column could be a strategy that the student could use to remember the information. And one more accommodation or adaptation that we use for helping children with self-monitoring is, all those nice, nifty, great, explicit checklists, some that are even personalized so that the child can become aware and check their work. So these are wonderful strategies that we use as special educators to help the child develop those compensatory strategies for the weak processing skills that they have. And as I said before, we did spend some time on understanding how working memory and executive functions help children learn, and how does that impede the learning when children have those weaknesses in those areas. But there are other cognitive processing deficits that have been identified as part of the gamut of processes associated with children with SLD. And although there is a high level of heterogeneity in SLD, the meta-analysis of the literature indicated by Evelyn Johnson, who happened to be one of my professors, and I thank her for all that I learned from her, together with Humphrey, Mellard, Woods, and Swanson, all recognize that these 5 different cognitive processes as really typically associated with children with SLD. And those are executive functions, visual working memory, verbal working memory, short-term memory, and processing speed. These processes altogether are specifically associated with specific academic areas, and there is much documented research that makes the link between specific cognitive processes and specific academic areas. So let's say in math, a different gamut of processes would be more linked as opposed to the ones in reading, and I'm going to kind of go through that a little bit at a faster pace just because of timing. As you see here, the cognitive processes associated with math include auditory working memory, nonverbal problem solving, long-term memory, and executive function and attention, as well as processing speed. The arrows in between indicate what I want to portray, that pathways between these processes help us focus our attentions on performing the task, whether it be executing a 2- or 3-step math sequence, math calculation, or word problem solving, as opposed to using just 1 or 2 or 3 in isolation. It's more the integration between all these skills that help us perform the task with high proficiency. The same goes with reading, and in reading, and any one of you in the audience or teachers, reading teachers, you are very interested to focus on the 3 main areas in reading, which are decoding, fluency, and comprehension. Again, as you see, I list the various cognitive processes that seem to be most linked with reading as per the documentation and the research. And as you see, again, visual span, processing, flexible attention, that flexible cognition that we were talking about before, auditory discrimination, visual discrimination, sequential processing, all seem to be involved in helping the child decode the text, be fluent in reading the text, and comprehend the task. And these seem to be the learning tools that our children are going to need in order to become more proficient. So if we have deficiency in executive functions or auditory processing or visual processing, seemingly it is intuitive and natural to say that there will be some difficulty. So these findings really support the need for intervention methods that would be geared to increasing the performance or the functioning levels of these skills. And there is much research that talks about, what we can do in neuroscience and what has been accomplished in the last 20 years and all the advancement through fMRI studies and neuroscience advancements that have been going on for the past 10 years and in the last year or so. So the question remains and is, would neuroscience-based cognitive skill training have any impact on the specific cognitive deficits that are assessed in children with SLD? Would looking at another area of research or another domain, another disciplinarian help us help the children with their weak neurological processes? Granted that we know how to accommodate for them, is there any way to remediate them? And I didn't come up with that all by myself. Some theoretical support has been given to me through digging in the literature, and I love this quote from Flanagan, just because it gives us the parameters that an overall cognitive intellectual ability of the child is a likely requisite if we are to help them achieve at or close to grade level. If we are to help them achieve at or close to grade level, an average cognitive ability is required. This surely supports the notion of the study. And as all researchers do, you look back and see, is there any other research or past findings that support this kind of methodology? And I have some here, and there's obviously a little bit more than that. Not too many, though. It is quite limited. But Torkel Klingberg, a neuroscientist at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, and his colleagues conducted a study of children with ADHD, and they found that better working memory skills may reduce ADHD problems. And in another study, children trained in the EF skill, executive function skills of selective attention, they were quicker to respond than the control group. And these results suggest that executive function training may affect the way children's brain develop. However, there's much to learn still in this area, and we don't know, and for example, we have no idea how the brain's adaptation to executive function training might be. Is it something that's gradual, one that accumulates over an extended amount of time? Does it happen when there's much more integration of other skills? And we don't know enough yet, but we do know that there is a theory, the theory of neuroplasticity, which is quite old. In the 70s, the Hebbian theory of neuroplasticity explained that the brains are plastic, between quotes and quotes. That is, that with training modification, with training, modification to the neural activities can lead to improved function of that skill. If I train that skill, I will get it improved somewhat, and we know this from lots of traumatic experiences and people who went through therapy. That neural modification can be achieved. There's another principle that really supports going for cognitive skill training, which is the principle of automaticity. Automaticity is defined or achieved when performance of a primary skill is minimally affected by other ongoing tasks. So it means that when one is automatic about a certain skill when I require less conscious effort in that skill, leaving me the rest of my brain to kind of work on the more difficult part of the task. For example, you may remember learning to drive and having to pay so much attention to each individual task at first, such as the brakes, the rear view mirror, the wheel. And when the process became fluid for you, you now can drive, and now you can even answer the crying baby in the back of the car, or your husband asking you for the next time you guys can have a date. So both the theory of neuroplasticity and automaticity support the notion that we can stimulate an increase in performance through cognitive skill training and perhaps yielding a high level of efficiency. And these serve really as the framework to the study. Much, like a web. And again, just training skills in isolation seems to be insufficient. And again, pulling out information from neuroscience and the concept of neuroplasticity and automaticity, that it's the integration of all these skills together that seems to be necessary. And without sounding like an oversimplification of what happens in our brain, which is still not all that fleshed out, it seems that our brain functions like a web. And so increasing the brain's ability to process these multiple systems at the same time and with a certain level of automaticity, that seems to be integral to increasing the function of each one of these systems. So when I looked at BrainWare and it digged into the description and what it does and how it was designed and saw that it included 20 exercises working on 41 skills in 6 categories that are attention, memory, visual processing, auditory processing, sensory integration, and thinking. I thought, well, this sounds like it will not only serve the way it's designed, it seems like it doesn't isolate any particular skill, but really promote the integration of those individual skills. But I don't know, and I didn't know whether it is possible to even increase any particular proficiency or the integration of all proficiencies together. And that was the backbone of the research. So again, as a researcher, you go back and see, was there any study performed on the product? And yes, they were. Dr. Sarah Avtzon and Helms in 2006 and 2007 examined the impact of this software on the cognitive and academic achievement of children with 34 participants, ages 6 to 12. They had both a study group and a control group, and they looked at the effect of cognitive performance and the effect on academic achievement. Those two are really go hand in hand almost when we're trying to do these kind of studies, because the biggest question, as all of you might ask, is, is the cognitive skill training going to yield academic gains? Otherwise, why waste the time? And so in this particular study, the participants were either typically developing or at risk, and the study results were still very striking. These were published results in the Journal of Optometry and Vision Development, where the BrainWare group, or the intervention group, has seen a 4.3 years of growth in cognition and almost a 2-year growth in academic, while the control group experienced a 4-month growth and a 1-month growth in academic gains. So again, something that suggests that this might be a nice way to promote the cognitive performance and to increase the cognitive performance, academic performance of young children, or of children, I should say, in general. But it still did not answer my question. Does it also yield significant impact, or statistically significant impact, on the specific cognitive deficits that are associated with SLD? And now we know which one they are. And does it do so for the cognitive deficits as well as the academic achievement? And that purpose is basically what drove the entire study. So we established an experimental study, a quantitative study, which included this intervention. And again, the participants in the study had to purchase the intervention and be involved with it separate and apart from the research. My involvement with the participants were in doing the pre-test and the post-test, as I'll explain in a moment. And they had to complete the intervention over a 3-month training. The core concept of the intervention is that students should be completing the exercises in the software 3 to 5 days with a minimum of 30 minutes to 45 minutes, 3 to 5 days a week. And I would be pre-testing them and post-testing them. To answer the questions or the hypotheses is, does BrainWare increase the overall cognitive ability? Does it do anything to the 5 variables, the 5 processing deficits that we talked about as the main characteristics of children with SLD? And does it increase their academic achievement in reading and math upon completion of the intervention? And I'll open up a parenthesis right there. I mean, I knew at the onset that students completing the intervention may not have yet so if anything, and even if the intervention had worked, I knew that at the onset that they may not be huge academic gains, because the assumption is that their brain has been in the process of being strengthened, if I can even mention that, and so they haven't had yet the ability or the opportunity to use those strengthened skills in a classroom setting to learn the information. And perhaps I should be looking at their academic gains 3 months after the intervention. But I was too curious, and I wanted to know what happens upon completion of the intervention, as well as I will be seeing, God willing, whether those gains are maintained or even higher. And at this point, I'd like to express my deep gratitude to the two New York City schools, namely Susulu Charter School and the Ihud program in Brooklyn, both schools who have participated in the study with both the experimental students as well as the control students. There wouldn't be enough time to express the deep gratitude that I have towards all that you have done, and hopefully we can meet in person again so we can discuss, we can really do so and discuss further plans. But at this time, I want to reiterate that the randomization happened, and it was based on a quantitative experimental process. There were 44 participants, grades 2 to 4. The average age of the participants was somewhere 9 years old, and the average grade was somewhere between 3 and 4. I had used the pre-test and the post-test to assess the children's cognitive ability as well as the brief academic performance using the Woodcock-Johnson. And this really explains how the study really was conducted. The control group kept their usual business and usual routine in special education or any other intervention that they were doing. No change to their business as usual, while the group in the intervention, the treated group, had the brain training program. And we wanted to see whether there was a change over time from the pre-assessment to the post-assessment, both in cognition and in academics. I'm going to open up a parenthesis, but I will not give a lesson in statistics. I will not overwhelm you, I promise. But I just want to clarify one point, which really helps us in understanding, solid studies and examine solid studies. So the scores I've used are the W and the W-DIF scores. Those are two scores that are generated by the WJ3, the Woodcock-Johnson 3 normative update. Those scores I chose specifically because they were equal interval scores, and I chose those as opposed to age equivalent scores or grade equivalent scores, because I want to explain something that happens when we score performance of children with SS scores, standard scores, or with age scores and grade scores. They are not equal intervals, and you may understand this in simple terms by seeing the growth of a child, a 3-year-old, let's say, a growth of 3 months for a 3-year-old is very different than that of a 9-year-old, 3 months for a 9-year-old. The growth is just different. So by saying that the child grew by 3 months, or the growth in months is by 3 months, it may be very different when you look at a 3-year-old or at a 5-year-old and a 12-year-old or a 9-year-old for that matter. So using the W and W-DIF scores, which are really they're part of the WJ score, really gives us an equal interval. Whatever growth it is the same equal interval, whether it be at 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 9 years, at any age. And that, to me, was a very solid way of sharing information and seeing whether, in fact, that growth is a real growth, is it an equal integral growth, or it could be a huge growth for a younger child and not the same for an older child. Now, I used those scores and converted them to RPI score, and at this point I have to express again thanks to, this time to Dr. McGrew, who is the one who created and published the WJ3 assessment battery. He was completely I have almost no words, generous and kind to provide me with the conversion of the W scores into age score and grade scores based on the norm tables that he had used for the whole population that he normed the WJ3 on. And that was wonderful. So I'm really thankful to have this more robust information to share because the scores that I've used at least are W scores that were converted into RPI scores and into age equivalence and grade score. And when they're converted, they're based on the equal interval, so they're no longer not equivalent, not the same for a younger and an older child. Okay, with that parenthetical information, I want to share the results of the findings on the 5 underlying cognitive skill areas that we talked about. And here it is. Looking at this graph, I've still on a high, so it's hard for me to even put this in words. The proficiency scores that I relate on this graph represent the probability of answering correctly when peers achieve 90% success. So it means, these type of scores, the RPI, what we call the RPI score, the proficiency scores. It's how proficient a child will be on this task. We, as educators, desire children to achieve a 90% proficiency level, if you see that top of the bar. That's where we want most of our children to be at. And in the study, we are using this kind of RPI score to see what's the level of proficiency when a child, let's say, reads a passage with a passage and is asked some reading comprehension question. At what proficiency level is that child? So in the graph, if we're looking at reading, because that's just simpler to look at, the control group had a 29, about 30% proficiency level, and that's at pre-test, and at post-test they had something close to 30%, while the experimental group had a little higher at the beginning, so perhaps more like 36% RPI level. They operated with 96% on a reading passage, let's say, and at post-test, after the intervention, they were close to 77%. In math, the same thing. They started, the control group started at 46% proficiency level and got close to 48%, while the experimental group went up to 77%. I made a mistake when I read the reading one, I think. The reading one is at 68%, while the math one is at 77%. So that's the growth in RPI level in reading and math. So for all those concerned about academic gains, after the neuroscience-based cognitive training in reading and math, there was a huge increase, yet not enough to get them at a desirable level of 90% that we would like to have them at. And although it is lower, it is significantly higher than what the control group experienced. And if we look at the overall cognitive performance, named over here on the chart by GIA, the General Intellectual Performance or Achievement, we see a huge growth as well. In 3 months of regular special education intervention, the control group is still 26% behind peers, typically developing peers. As you see, it's 64% proficiency at the beginning, 61% proficiency, and 64% at post-test, while the experimental group, after 3 months of completing the intervention, has nearly caught up with their peers in cognitive proficiency at about 89%. That's just 1% behind the 90% level, the desirable level. So let's look at that in a more detailed fashion. Our study was about the 5 different variables, and because I tested children on most of the tests of the WJ, I was also able to get the scores on auditory processing and broad attention, those last 2 bars that you see on the graph. But our first 5 are the initial and the variables that we really were interested in looking at and seeing whether these cognitive deficits associated with children with SLD see an increase. And the control group, again, is in red, blue, that's in pre. The blue one is in post, and then the study group is the green and purple. And I realized that for some reason it didn't copy on all of the different bars, but so it's either gray and purple or green and purple for the post-test. And as you see, if you look at those numbers at the top of each of those higher bars, which indicate the study post-achievement for each one of these processes, nearly all of them made it to 90% or above, while the control group went up by 1% in proficiency, 74 to 75, 81 to 83, or 46 to 55, 82 to 83, 61 to 64. And I want to bring your attention actually to visual memory and short-term memory, as well as auditory processing. Those seem to have had the biggest impact. The students managed to just increase their performance to or above the 90% level for all those 4 different processes, namely working memory, both visual and verbal, short-term memory, and auditory processing. This does not give less importance to the other ones. Executive function went up to 88%. It is 2 points behind, desirable levels. Processing speed to 87%, and that again is huge, and brought attention to 93%. Hard to keep track of all that, but the previous slide expressed the numbers in RPI, and as I told you, I wanted to share these numbers in RPI because of the robust information that it indicates, but at the same time, I wanted it to be tangible, and by having that conversion table from Dr. McGrew really helped, and I am able to give you what that means, what those W scores mean in not only in proficiency levels, but also in months, in improvement in terms of months, years, or grade. So we'll look first at growth in months, and the overall cognitive performance increased by 34 months, or about 2.8 years increase in cognitive growth. And each one of those processing deficits also increased to high levels, 30 months for executive functions, 79 for visual working memory, verbal working memory 40, 17 for processing speed, short-term memory 52, auditory processing 66, and broad attention 41 months. And I guess it's easier to understand or make the connection when we look at grades because it's by 12 months. So whatever was generated in the last slide, you see it here in years. So an average of 3 years, 2.8 to 3 years. In cognitive performance, overall cognitive performance, 2.8 years of increase, and in each one of the skills, some peaking to 6 years of improvement, like auditory processing and visual working memory, while others, like executive function and processing speed, executive functions being 2 years, 2.4 years of improvement, and working memory 3 years, broad attention 3 years. And the one that has seen the least improvement is processing speed 1.3. Again, all these would increase if processing speed had picked up a little bit more. Possibly the general cognitive performance would have also picked up a bit more. But at this point, this is what the students managed to have as at their post-test. And again, I'm still on a high from this, and I experienced this. I experienced it when I was post-testing the children were telling me, like one of them I still remember said, "Miss Sarah, can we switch to the other game, the game that you had at the pretest?" And she put her hands over her eyes, then over her ears, not wanting me to do that task that tested visual and auditory attention. But then at post-test, she said, Oh, that's easy. I can do it, Miss Sarah. It's like sky scanning on the computer. I like that. That's okay. Those words it's still with me all day long, and just their persistence on the task was so different at post-test. But again, who am I? So I needed those stats before I can count my blessings. And yes, indeed, the stats showed increase. And for all of us who are concerned, and especially educators, we are glad to see that there is an increase in cognitive performance, and we understand that somehow, somewhere, it would lead to some academic improvement. But does it really? I know that there is a connection between cognitive skills and academics, but do the gains in cognition increase the gains in academics? And that's really the key question. And right here, you can see what are the gains that were obtained upon completion of the intervention. These are not any time after, 3 or 4 or 6 months after the intervention. These are right at the completion of the intervention, meaning that students are just having their skills, if anything, renewed from what we see in the findings or strengthened. And as we understand, again, from what I explained before in neuroplasticity, it is a gradual increase, and it's the integration and the fluidity, the automaticity that's obtained that really yields higher gains. But we already saw the study generated some result that shows us that really there was some academic gain, actually quite big between control and experimental. If we look at the reading gains for the control group, it's 2 months, less than 2 months of increase of growth, while for the reading it's a 10-month growth. And for math, the control group did grow by 2 months, by a full 2 months, but by a full year in math for the study group. So there was some growth in the control group, as we've seen also in the cognitive performance, just a smaller growth. And the gains in academics are quite huge when we look at a 10-month growth and a 12-month growth for special educators. This is called really huge. And in terms of grade equivalence, again, converting those months, so it's for reading, it would be 8.8 grade, like 8 months of a grade, and for math, it would be a full grade of increase. This is what I call a mouthful, but I hope it was not overwhelming, but hopefully related. What I want to circle back to the statement of Flanagan that we need an overall average or cognitive or intellectual ability is a requisite. We need it in order to close the gap between for children who have SLD or have disabilities to achieve at or close to grade level. And this intervention seemed to have helped that overall intellectual ability and yielded some achievement and brought them up close to grade level, not yet to grade level, but certainly closer than where they were or closer to where the control group was. So research, the goal of research is really to imply some social change, and all of us here have a deep motivation to understand or find ways to adapt our strategies, to increase our strategies so we can better serve and empower our children. So some of the implications of these results is that we may want to think about remediating the processes as opposed to solely compensating for them. This does not mean forget about all those accommodations. It just means use them for the time that they're needed, and based on comprehensive assessment, one could determine when they're not needed any longer. But it seems that we can train those processes, and we can increase their performance, thereby increasing academic performance as well. And my favorite line is increase the function and decrease the stress. Increase the function of those weaknesses so that we can decrease the stress and the motivational and emotional consequences associated with learning. And again, Dr. Schultz comes to mind always when I talk about stress, because she's the guru about information of how learning disability is linked to stress and to motivation. Dr. Schultz, again, is the faculty of Harvard Medical School. And learning difficulties, she says, can be the consequence of being upset. Many teachers do not make this connection unless they have worked with children who have emotional disturbance. The teachers understand that the emotional reactions are, in many cases, those negative behaviors that are the coping mechanisms triggered by the stress, which is usually or mainly generated by frustration and fear of what a child sees as inevitable failure. So I understand all this a lot more now, that many of these negative emotions and troubling behaviors go away when students feel competent and successful. I've seen it, I've lived it, I've experienced it. Her words come back to me. But after working with the students at BrainWare, and I heard them saying, "Oh, I can do this. It's like sky scanning. It's like web weaving. It's like llama logic." I feel literally empowered. It's my dopamine dose for the day. It's again hard to put in words, but certainly a great level of joy when you see a child being able to sequence. Who was not able to sequence, let's say, 3 words and give that to you in a forward sequence, and now could give you up to 5 words in forward and reverse sequence. That's awesome. So in terms of implications to social change, we can target those unique underlying processing skills and especially those that are linked with academic failure. We can help close the achievement gap between children with SLD and typically developing peers. And even better, this intervention, since it has been proven already by Dr. Sarah Avtzon and Helms that it's effective with regular and at-risk students, it could be introduced, or I should say one of the suggestions could be to include it when children are first observed as having difficulties that would lead to academic failure, perhaps when or before they receive Title I or when they're in Tier 1 or Tier 2 or 3 of RTI. And the takeaway is perhaps, in summation of all this information, is perhaps to blend neuroscience, cognitive skill training, and special education. And blending both is a winning combination. what I can think of. My joy can be yours, and I know we can share the same moments. I would enjoy anybody replicating what I did, and seeing and feeling and tangibly seeing the empowerment that we can bring to children. I am ready to answer any questions you may have, and I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation, and that although it may have had a lot of information and background knowledge, I did feel that it was important in understanding where we are and where the controversies that are happening in our field are, so that we can be more intelligent about selecting and deciding what to include and what to give our children with SLD. It is important not to take more of their time. They do need leisure time after school, and I wouldn't want to see them wasting their time on anything unless it was beneficial. They're pulled enough during the daytime and after school, and let's hope that when we blend neuroscience and special education, we can achieve the powerful results we did. Thank you.
Sarah, that was just great. Thank you so much. I know we've run over. I think we've lost some people, who I'm sure, who needed to go. But Sarah, would it be okay to just take a few questions still at this point?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, great. Sarah,
absolutely.
We have a couple. We have a couple that have come in. I'll kind of do them in order they came in. There was one from, I'm trying to find it now, Jerry Tagawa. I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. I am really bad at that. Wanted to know, how do you find the correlation between the SLD and the psychological deficit?
How do you find a correlation? So a psychological deficit it means those processes that are of deficit to the child, and these are linked with specific academic areas, as I explained. And so I don't know if I'm answering if I understood your question quite well, but the correlation has been, I haven't established it. It's been established through documented research. Some of the resources or the sources are listed on my PowerPoint, where a meta-analysis, especially the one done by Evelyn Johnson, has shown that, analyzing all the different research and studies that have been published on the psychological deficit of SLD, she has noted some key patterns and key characteristics that seem to be the same for all children with SLD, although there are variations in who is determined as SLD, and there's so many different kinds of SLD. Those psychological deficits seem to be the ones associated with SLD, and those that I have listed on my slides seem to be associated with academic deficits or academic failure.
Okay, we are running a little late, but I think there's two more here. If we can get to them, and then we'll any other questions deal with in a different way. This one is from Carol Treat. She wants to know, did you worry about the retest reliability on the cognitive assessment given 3 months later?
Absolutely, and I did. I did use the same forms and the same tests according to my discussions with various committee members and psychologists. Given the fact that the control group was going to be doing the same thing, so that would kind of square out the familiarity effect. The same familiarity would have been for the control and the experimental group, and since both of them would be given the same tests 3 months later, we wanted to see more of a connection instead of using two different tests that would not necessarily be compatible or correlated. The easier way was to use the same test, but because it was going to be used for both groups, if there would be an increase that would be affected by familiarity, it would be the same for both, for the control as well, and we haven't seen that. The difference in scores has shown us differently.
And then the last one for tonight, and one other comment before we wrap it up, just for those of you that may be logged on a couple minutes late, and I'm getting lots of questions about the presentation. We will be posting the recording within a week, and you will all receive an email as part of when it is posted so that you can watch it again, and you will also be receiving a copy of the slides thanks to Sarah's generosity. And that should be coming to your email box either tomorrow or on Friday. Now, the last question. You shared grade. This comes from Lila, and I'm not even going to attempt your last name. You shared grade and age equivalents, but I understand that these to be the least accurate way to communicate level of functioning. Do we have this information in standard scores or percentiles?
Well, excellent question, Lila. And Lila, this hello, could you hear me? Hello.
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, great. I don't know why I was hearing like a mute noise, sound. That's great. Yes, Lila, this is a great question, and actually, I don't know whether you attended that part of the presentation, but mainly. I did not want to go with standard scores, or just because of that same reason I explained about equal interval scores. Standard scores are not robust, and that's why I went with the W and W.This scores. Again, I've definitely delved into the situation deeply, just because of the concern that we may all have that it's not so accurate, or it's the least accurate way to communicate, as you say, the level of functioning. So I moved away from grade scores and age scores and standard scores. I communicated those, but remember, as I said, they were converted from W scores using the norm table from Dr. McGrew. So they wouldn't be the ones they wouldn't be generated as you would if you were to calculate SS scores and AE scores. That will not be equal intervals. These were W scores that were equal intervals and converted to what they mean in age scores based on the average population in the United States. So I communicated those through a conversion as opposed to what they would be if you were to just score your tables and get SS scores and grade scores. Those will not be the same as the ones that I generated. What I have shared again is based on an equal interval basis, which is the strongest and more reasonable way to use for statistical analysis, and that is the W.This scores.
And presumably you're going to be including those in your analysis as you move towards your publication, your dissertation, and all that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I wouldn't want to share them in SS scores because that would, although it probably would show more increase, more growth, that would not be an accurate growth because that growth is, as I said, is not the same for a younger child as for an older child. And so the SS scores do not give me the accurate information. That's exactly the reason why I went the other way and the more cumbersome and lengthy and hard way. But Dr. McGrew was so generous and kind to help us in this process. I guess we're all motivated by the same causes.
Well, great. If there are more questions, we will try to respond to people. I know Sarah is very interested in talking with others about the experience of, if you have questions, we can certainly put you in touch with her. I want to thank everybody so much for their being here with us today. I hope you feel that you learned some things and that your brains, as well as we talked about a mouthful before, but hopefully your brains are full as well. Sarah, thank you again so much for sharing your research with us today. And we will look forward to seeing all of you at another Neuroscience and Education webinar in the near future. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
You're welcome. Thank you all.